America is quietly becoming unaffordable, and if you're not feeling it yet, you will soon. Right now, over 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Credit card debt has exploded past $1 trillion, and the average household is spending hundreds more every single month just to afford the same life they had a few years ago. Food prices are up over 30% since 2020. Rent has surged more than 25% nationwide, and basic necessities like insurance, utilities, and healthcare are rising faster than wages can keep up. And here's the reality. Even if you're making more money today, your purchasing power is shrinking in real time. So if it feels like you're working harder but falling behind anyway, that's not in your head. The system is getting more expensive by design, and it's happening faster than most people are prepared for. The grocery bill is just the symptom. The real problem is what's happening behind the scenes with food production, and almost nobody is talking about it. So yeah, everyone sees the $10 cereal boxes, the $7 cheese slices, the $175 grocery runs, and it feels insane, but what most people don't realize is that the actual cost of producing food in the United States has fundamentally changed in a way that's not going back anytime soon. And that's the part you should really be paying attention to. Because since 2020, fertilizer costs spiked as much as 80% at their peak due to natural gas prices and global supply disruptions. And even though they've come down slightly, they're still significantly higher than pre-pandemic levels, which means farmers are paying more just to grow the same crops. On top of that, diesel fuel, which powers tractors, irrigation systems, and transportation, has remained volatile, and every single increase in diesel adds cost at every stage of the supply chain, from the farm to the distribution center to your local grocery store shelf. And here's where it gets even worse. The U.S. has been losing small and mid-sized farms at a steady pace, with thousands shutting down over the last few years, which means food production is becoming more concentrated in fewer, larger corporations that have more pricing power. That's not a conspiracy, that's just consolidation. And when fewer players control more supply, prices tend to stay high. Now add labor into the equation, because agricultural labor shortages have been increasing due to stricter immigration policies and an aging workforce, and farms are having to pay significantly more to attract workers, which again raises costs. And here's something most people don't think about: crop insurance and climate volatility. Extreme weather events, droughts in California, floods in the Midwest, heat waves in Texas are making harvests less predictable, which forces producers to price in risk, meaning you're not just paying for food anymore, you're paying for uncertainty. And all of this compounds into one simple reality. Even if inflation numbers cool down, grocery prices are not going back to what they were, because the baseline cost of producing food has permanently shifted upward. So when you're standing there wondering how a basic cart of groceries hits $150 without trying, it's not just inflation, it's a structural reset of the entire food system. And that's why this is not a temporary problem. It's the new normal. Housing costs aren't just high, they're quietly reshaping how Americans live, and most people haven't fully realized the long-term consequences yet. At this point, everyone knows rent is expensive. Everyone knows buying a house feels impossible. But what's really happening underneath the surface is a massive shift in affordability that is fundamentally changing financial behavior across the entire country. And this is where things start to get a little concerning. Because as of 2025-2026, the median home price in the U.S. is still hovering around $400,000. And mortgage rates have stayed elevated compared to the ultra-low levels we saw just a few years ago, which means the monthly payment on that same house has effectively doubled for many buyers. Not because the house got better, not because incomes doubled, but purely because of financing costs. And here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. Even people who already own homes are stuck because they're locked into low mortgage rates from previous years, which discourages them from selling, which reduces housing supply, which keeps prices high. So you have this weird situation where fewer homes are available, demand is still strong, and prices don't correct the way people expect. Now let's talk about rent, because that's where the real pressure is hitting. In many cities, rent has increased 25–40% compared to pre-2020 levels, and wages have not kept up at the same pace, which means a larger percentage of income is going toward housing than at almost any point in recent history. And when that happens, people start cutting everywhere else, less spending on food, less spending on healthcare, less saving, less investing, and that creates a ripple effect throughout the economy. But here's something that most people don't realize. Institutional investors and large corporations have been buying up single-family homes in large quantities, especially in fast-growing areas, turning them into rental properties, which further reduces the number of homes available for individual buyers. So you're not just competing with other families anymore, you're competing with billion-dollar funds. And when you combine all of that higher interest rates, limited supply, rising rents, and institutional ownership, you end up with a system where housing is no longer just expensive, it's structurally unaffordable for a growing percentage of the population. And the reason this matters so much is because housing is the largest expense for most people. So when that one category becomes unstable, everything else starts to break down. And that's when you start to see the real effects of a cost of living crisis, not just higher prices, but a complete shift in how people live, spend, and plan their future. Healthcare costs are rising in a way that's far more dangerous than groceries or rent because most people don't even see it happening until it's too late. Now here's something that doesn't hit you every single week like groceries, but when it does, it hits hard, and that's healthcare. And I really don't think people fully understand just how quickly this is getting out of control. Because if you look at the data, healthcare spending in the US has now crossed over $4.5 trillion annually, which is nearly 18% of the entire economy. And yet, despite spending more than any other country by a wide margin, Americans are still paying more out of pocket than ever before. Premiums for employer-sponsored health insurance have increased roughly 20% over the last 5 years, and deductibles have risen so much that many people are effectively paying thousands of dollars before their insurance even starts to help. And here's the part that most people don't realize. Even if your paycheck looks stable, your real income is quietly being reduced because more of it is being diverted into healthcare costs behind the scenes, whether through higher premiums, co-pays, or reduced employer benefits. It's like a hidden tax that doesn't show up as a line item, but it's absolutely there. And then you have prescription drug prices, which in the US are often 2 to 3 times higher than in other developed countries, even for the exact same medications produced by the same companies. On top of that, hospitals have been consolidating at an aggressive pace, meaning fewer independent providers and more pricing power concentrated in large healthcare systems, which leads to higher costs for the same procedures. And here's where it gets really concerning. Medical debt is now one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States, with tens of millions of Americans carrying some form of healthcare-related debt, and many of them are insured. That's the crazy part. You can do everything right, have insurance, have a job, and still get financially wrecked by one unexpected medical event. And when you combine rising premiums, higher deductibles, expensive prescriptions, and increasing consolidation, you end up with a system where the cost keeps going up regardless of inflation data or economic cycles. So even if everything else stabilized tomorrow, which it won't, healthcare alone would still be enough to keep the cost of living crisis getting worse. And that's why this one is so dangerous. Because unlike groceries or rent, you don't get to shop around when you need it. You just pay whatever it costs. The job market might look strong on the surface, but underneath, income isn't keeping up with reality, and that's where the real pressure starts to build. At first glance, you might hear that unemployment is relatively low, job numbers look okay, and everything seems stable, but when you actually dig into what's going on, the situation is a lot more complicated, and honestly, a lot more concerning than most headlines make it seem. Because while wages have increased over the last few years, they haven't kept pace with the actual cost of living, especially when you factor in housing, healthcare, food, and insurance, all rising simultaneously. Real wages, meaning wages adjusted for inflation, have been relatively flat for a large portion of the population, which means even if you're earning more on paper, your purchasing power isn't improving the way you'd expect. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. A growing number of people are working multiple jobs just to maintain the same standard of living they had a few years ago. That's part of why job numbers can look strong, because one person working 2 or 3 jobs counts multiple times in employment data. So the headline number might say jobs are up, but it doesn't tell you that people are stretched thinner than ever. On top of that, many of the jobs being added are concentrated in lower-paying sectors, like hospitality, retail, and gig work, while higher-paying white-collar industries are starting to show signs of slowing down, especially with automation and AI beginning to replace certain roles. And then there's the issue of job stability, because even if you have a decent income today, there's a growing sense of uncertainty about how secure that income really is over the next few years. Companies are becoming more cautious, layoffs in certain sectors are increasing, and hiring freezes are becoming more common, particularly in tech and finance. So what you end up with is this strange disconnect where the economy looks fine on paper, but people feel worse off in their day-to-day lives. And that gap between perception and reality is exactly what defines a cost of living crisis. Because it's not just about prices going up, it's about incomes failing to keep up in a way that actually matters. And when that happens, people don't just cut back, they fall behind. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Energy costs are quietly bleeding your budget in ways that most people completely underestimate, and the worst part is that it's built into almost everything you buy. At this point, most people think about energy costs as just gas prices at the pump, or maybe their monthly electricity bill, but the reality is way bigger than that, and this is one of those hidden layers of the cost of living crisis that's making everything more expensive without you even realizing it. Because energy is what economists call a base input, meaning it affects the cost of producing and transporting literally everything in the economy, and when energy prices rise even slightly, it creates a ripple effect that spreads across every industry. Now, over the last few years, electricity prices in the US have increased significantly, with some regions seeing double-digit percentage increases annually, especially in states dealing with grid upgrades, extreme weather, or shifts toward renewable energy infrastructure, which requires massive upfront investment. And here's the thing. Utility companies are allowed to pass those costs directly onto consumers, so when infrastructure gets more expensive, your bill goes up, and there's not much you can do about it. But it doesn't stop there, because natural gas prices, heating costs, and gasoline all feed into transportation and logistics, which means every time a truck delivers goods to a store, those higher fuel costs are baked into the price you pay at checkout. And this is where it gets really interesting, because even when oil prices come down temporarily, companies are very slow to reduce prices on goods, meaning you get the increases quickly, but the decreases take forever, if they happen at all. Now layer on top of that the geopolitical situation, with ongoing tensions in energy-producing regions, supply chain disruptions, and strategic reserves being used more aggressively than in the past, which reduces the buffer that used to stabilize prices during shocks. And then there's the transition to green energy, which, long-term, could be beneficial, but short-term is incredibly expensive, requiring trillions of dollars in infrastructure, subsidies, and grid modernization, all of which ultimately gets funded by taxpayers and consumers. So what you end up with is a situation where energy costs are rising both directly and indirectly, and they're not just affecting your monthly bills, they're embedded in your groceries, your rent, your travel, your services, everything. And that's why even when inflation headlines say things are cooling, it doesn't feel that way in real life, because the underlying cost structure of the economy has shifted upward due to energy, and that's something that doesn't reverse quickly. It just becomes part of the new baseline, and you end up paying for it every single day, whether you realize it or not. Insurance is becoming one of the fastest growing expenses in America, and almost nobody is prepared for how much worse it's about to get. This is one of those categories that doesn't get nearly as much attention as rent or groceries, but if you really start looking at your expenses, you'll notice that insurance across the board is getting dramatically more expensive, and it's happening faster than most people expect. Whether it's car insurance, home insurance, health insurance, or even renter's insurance, premiums have been rising at a pace that's outstripping general inflation, and there are a few very specific reasons why this is happening that most people don't fully understand. First, auto insurance has been hit hard by the rising cost of vehicle repairs, because modern cars are packed with sensors, cameras, and advanced technology, which makes even minor accidents significantly more expensive to fix. So insurers are paying out more per claim, which means they raise premiums across the board to compensate. At the same time, accident rates have increased in certain areas, and fraud has also been on the rise, which adds even more pressure to the system. Then you look at home insurance, and this is where things get really serious, because in states like Florida, California, and Texas, premiums have skyrocketed due to increased risks from hurricanes, wildfires, and extreme weather events. In some cases, insurance companies are pulling out of entire markets altogether because the risk is too high, leaving homeowners with fewer options and much higher costs. And here's something that most people don't realize. When insurance companies exit a market, the remaining providers can charge significantly more because there's less competition. Now combine that with rebuilding costs, which have gone up due to higher material and labor expenses, and you get a situation where even if your home value hasn't changed much, the cost to insure it has increased dramatically. And then there's the broader financial side of things. Insurance companies invest the premiums they collect, and when interest rates and market conditions shift, it affects their profitability, which again gets passed on to consumers. So what you're seeing is this perfect storm where higher risk, higher repair costs, less competition, and changing financial conditions are all pushing insurance prices up at the same time. And the reason this matters so much is because insurance isn't optional. You can't just decide not to have it in most cases, especially if you have a car or a mortgage. So it becomes another fixed cost that keeps rising, eating into your budget, reducing your ability to save, and making the overall cost of living crisis feel even worse. And the scary part is, this is one of those trends that's not cyclical, it's structural, which means it's likely to keep getting worse before it gets better. Education costs are rising in a way that's quietly locking an entire generation into long-term financial pressure, and most people don't realize how deep the impact actually goes. Now, everyone already knows that college is expensive, student loans are a problem, and tuition has gone up, but what's really happening underneath that is a much bigger shift that's affecting not just students, but the entire economy in ways that are only starting to show up now. Because if you look at the numbers, tuition and fees at public and private universities have increased several times faster than inflation over the last 2 decades, and even though there's been a lot of attention on student debt relief and forgiveness programs, the actual cost of getting an education hasn't meaningfully come down. In fact, when you factor in housing, textbooks, transportation, and basic living expenses, the total cost of attending college is higher than ever, and that forces many students to either take on significant debt or delay higher education altogether. But here's where it gets more interesting, and honestly more concerning, because it's not just about college anymore. Even basic education-related expenses, like childcare and early education, have exploded in cost, with some families paying as much for childcare as they would for rent or a mortgage. And when that happens, it creates a situation where parents, especially younger families, are financially strained before they even have a chance to build wealth. Now layer on student loans, which in the US total over $1.7 trillion, and you start to see how this becomes a long-term drag on the economy. Because people with high student debt tend to delay buying homes, delay starting families, delay investing, and overall participate less in economic growth. And here's something that most people don't think about. Even if you don't have student loans, the system still affects you, because employers are increasingly requiring degrees for jobs that didn't used to need them, which raises the barrier to entry and forces more people into expensive education paths just to compete. And at the same time, the return on that investment is becoming less predictable because wages in many fields are not keeping up with the cost of education required to enter them. So you end up with this imbalance where the price of getting ahead keeps increasing, but the financial payoff is becoming less certain. And that's why this matters for the cost of living crisis, because it's not just about what you're paying today. It's about the long-term financial pressure that follows people for decades, shaping their spending, saving, and investment decisions. And when millions of people are all under that same pressure at once, it doesn't just affect individuals, it slows down the entire system. The way companies are pricing products today has fundamentally changed, and it's quietly making everything more expensive without most people even noticing why. So we've talked about inflation, supply chains, labor costs, all of that, but there's another layer here that's way more subtle and honestly kind of unsettling once you start to see it, and that's how pricing itself has evolved in the last few years. Because we're no longer living in a world where prices are just based on cost plus a fixed margin instead. Companies are increasingly using data, algorithms, and real-time analytics to figure out exactly how much you're willing to pay and then charging as close to that number as possible. This is called dynamic pricing, and it's already being used in industries like airlines and hotels, but now it's expanding into retail, groceries, and even everyday consumer goods. And here's how it works. Companies track purchasing behavior, location data, demand patterns, and even browsing history to adjust prices in ways that maximize profit, sometimes down to the individual level. So, two people could be looking at the same product and see slightly different prices or offers based on their behavior, and most of the time, they wouldn't even realize it. And this isn't just happening online, it's starting to show up in physical stores through digital price tags that can change throughout the day based on demand, inventory levels, or even time of day. Now add in subscription models, shrinkflation, and what's known as price anchoring, where companies introduce higher-priced options to make everything else seem more reasonable, and you get a system that's designed not just to respond to inflation, but to actively push prices higher whenever possible. And here's the key point. Once companies realize they can charge more without losing customers, they rarely go back to lower prices, even if their costs decrease. That's why you'll often see prices rise quickly during periods of inflation, but come down very slowly or not at all when conditions improve. And when you combine that with market consolidation, where fewer large companies control more of the market, there's even less pressure to compete on price. So what you end up with is an environment where prices are not just increasing because things cost more to produce, but because companies have become much better at extracting as much value as possible from each customer. And that's a huge shift because it means the cost of living crisis isn't just being driven by external factors, it's also being reinforced by the way modern pricing systems are designed to work. And once that system is in place, it doesn't reverse, it just gets more efficient at doing the same thing over time. So here's the bottom line, and I really want you to think about this for a second. This isn't just about groceries being expensive or rent going up. This is about a long-term shift in how expensive it is to simply exist in America. And the people who recognize that early are the ones who adapt, while everyone else slowly falls behind without even realizing why. Because the reality is, this doesn't just fix itself overnight. Prices don't magically reset. Systems don't suddenly become cheaper. If anything, they tend to keep moving in the same direction, just a little slower, just enough that most people don't react until it's too late. So the question isn't if things are getting more expensive. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you positioning yourself to keep up, or are you hoping things go back to the way they were? Anyway, I'm really curious what you think about this. What's gotten noticeably more expensive for you lately? Let me know down below in the comments. I read as many of them as I can. If you got value from this, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.